back to the deep dive. If you've ever been through an organizational change initiative, and let's be honest, most of us probably have at some point, you know that feeling. It can often feel like a strategic evolution and more like just navigating through fog.
Yeah.
Kind of chaotic.
Yeah, absolutely. Shifting priorities, maybe the outcomes aren't totally clear, and sometimes you get that frustrating sense that different parts of the organization are sort of fighting against the change, pulling in different directions.
Exactly. But the thing is, the challenge of organizational change, it isn't really about just accepting that chaos. It's more about recognizing that there are patterns underneath it all. There are specific causal links, predictable levers that can actually initiate successful transformation. That's really our mission today. We want to try and synthesize the academic models, the ones that help diagnose the why, the core systemic issues, with the more practical tools that guide the how, the actual execution of the change.
That's a great way to put it.
So we're working with two really critical sources today, and they span quite a few decades of organizational theory. First up, we've got excerpts from A Causal Model of Organizational Performance and Change. This one was published way back in 1992 by W. Warner Burke and George H. Litwin.
A foundational piece, really.
Definitely. And second, we're digging into excerpts from a more recent work, Change Fundamentals, the Change Statement, written by Marilu Goodyear in 2025.
Right. And what's fascinating, I think, is how these two readings really complement each other. The Burke and Litwin model, it's explicitly designed to give you that systemic view. It's not just about listing what organizational parts exist, but it really dives into the complex cause and effect relationships, the things that dictate performance. It's like a diagnostic blueprint for the organization.
A blueprint, I like that.
Yeah. And then Goodyear, she approaches the challenge more from a practitioner's angle. She asks that essential applied question. Okay, once we understand that causal system, how do we actually craft a plan, a change statement, she calls it, one that's so precise and clear that it actually motivates people to execute it successfully?
Okay.
So, by the end of this deep dive, our hope is that you, the listener, will be equipped not just with a theory of change, but with a pretty robust, structured way to diagnose where the problems might be, and then how to initiate plan change that, cuts through all the vague language and gets straight to the target.
Sounds like exactly what's needed. Getting beyond just talking about change to actually doing it effectively.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We can start with that sort of fundamental philosophy of change, which Goodyear brings up right at the beginning. There's this interesting academic debate she highlights. Is organizational change something we actively do? A distinct, planned effort, clear start, clear endpoints, like Kurt Lewin suggested way back.
Right, the classic unfreeze, change, refreeze idea, plan change.
Exactly. Or is change something that's just constantly happening all the time?
Yeah, the other side of the coin is stability just, well, an illusion, as Connor, Lake, and Stackman put it. An illusion created because there are these constant, relentless, destabilizing forces just battering the organization all the time.
So organizations are never really still.
That's the argument. They're always adapting or reacting or maybe resisting, always in motion in some way.
And those destabilizing forces. What are we talking about there?
Oh, think about it day to day. A new competitor jumps into the market. That's a big one.
Right.
Or a key employee leaves. Or maybe a regulatory body imposes some new constraint. These are, daily things pushing an organization off balance constantly.
It makes sense. If you really look closely at any organization, you'd probably see all those things happening at once.
You would. But here's where Goodyear makes a really critical pivot, I think. She says, look, regardless of whether the change was planned meticulously or maybe it was forced on you by a crisis, once the organization decides it needs to move forward, it absolutely must have a clear definition of what it's aiming for and a clear vision of what successful completion actually looks like.
So even if change is just happening to you, you still need to figure out where you want to end up.
Precisely. You have to formalize the destination even if you didn't choose the starting point. And if you are initiating it, you definitely have to define that destination first.
Because vague goals.
Vague goals are organizational poison. That's maybe the single biggest enemy of successful transformation, honestly.
Why is that? Seems obvious, but maybe unpack it.
Well, think about it. When there's confusion about, the interim steps or the ultimate desired outcome of some change proposal, that vacuum, it gets immediately filled by assumptions, speculation, rumors, all coming from the participants themselves.
Right. People make up their own stories.
They do, because Employees and managers, they function based on the information they have, right? And their own understanding of what the organization really prioritizes. So if you leave the goal unclear, you're practically guaranteeing diversion, resistance, probably failure.
Because everyone's working towards slightly different goals.
Or wildly different goals. If people don't know exactly what success looks like, they'll invent their own definitions. And those definitions, they're almost invariably going to conflict with each other.
Okay, so clarity is paramount. But then that strong argument for clarity immediately bumps up against something else, right? The complexity of modern organizations. How does a leader define a crystal clear goal when the organization is so technically sophisticated now? Maybe the leader doesn't even fully grasp all the implementation details themselves.
That's a huge question today, because modern organizations, they're these complex systems, right? Built on a combination of tasks and processes and technology, all steeped in technical specialization. The simple days, where maybe the CEO understood every single job function, those are pretty much long gone.
So specialization is key.
It is. And what that means practically is that organizations have to hire and rely on tons of technical experts. Engineers, data scientists, compliance officers who know specific regulations inside out.
Right.
These people apply specialized knowledge. And consequently, the leaders making those high-level strategic decisions, they become inherently dependent on those experts, dependent for knowledge, for perspective, and crucially for recommendations on how to actually implement the strategy.
So decisions rely on the group.
On the collective expertise of the organization, not just the insight of one person at the top.
Okay, that reality leads right into what Goodyear calls the implementation dilemma, where she uses the term the dance. It's that tension, isn't it, between the vision from the top and the reality on the ground.
Exactly. The dance, that's the crucial tension point. Any change you propose, it has to be vetted through the lens of that organizational expertise. Goodyear notes if the people who actually do the work, the experts in the trenches, if they look at the proposed change and say, nope, that's impractical, or that's unworkable, or maybe technically that's just not feasible.
Then it's dead in the water.
Pretty much. The change effort fails. We have decades of evidence showing that old-style command and control approaches, the ones that ignore the experience of the implementers, they fail spectacularly, even in organizations that look really hierarchical on paper.
You can't just order complexity away.
You really can't. You can't just order a complex system to function differently if the physical reality or the technical reality or the procedural reality contradicts that order.
So if the leader can't just command it, but they still have to maintain that clear vision, what's the answer? How do you resolve this implementation dilemma?
Well, the key takeaway for defining the goal is finding this balance. The goal has to be defined enough to actually motivate people to participate. And it needs to be clear enough about the outcome, the target, the destination.
Yeah.
But it also has to be flexible enough to allow for that implementation dance to actually happen.
So define the what's and why, but be open on the how.
Pretty much. The leader defines what the new reality looks like, the what and the why. They have to be clear. We must achieve this new reality. But then they have to allow the experts, the people who live the work every day, to refine how to get there. It means being flexible about the means of accomplishment.
Because if you force a path that the experts know is a dead end...
You sacrifice the whole mission, you lose their buy-in, and you probably fail anyway because the path was flawed.
Okay, but I wonder, though,
Yeah.
how does a senior leader, maybe someone who isn't super technical themselves, how do they vet the advice when they've got, say, 3 different teams of experts proposing 3 conflicting technical ways to implement something? Isn't the leader still kind of flying blind, dependent on whichever expert argues best, even if the vision of the outcome is clear?
That is the absolute daily challenge of modern leadership, isn't it? But the leader's expertise, it shifts. It shifts from knowing all the technical details themselves to mastering the diagnostic process.
Okay.
And this is where something like the Burke and Litwin model becomes so essential. It's about asking the right systemic questions. Questions like, which proposed solution fits best with our current organizational structure? Which one is going to be least disruptive to our deep-seated culture? Which one requires the most change or the least change in our day-to-day management practices?
So the model helps evaluate the ripple effects.
Exactly, the systemic ripple effect of each proposed solution. It lets the leader choose the path that seems to have the best chance of internal alignment, the path of least resistance, maybe, even if they don't understand the coding language itself.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. We're moving now from that sort of philosophical need for clarity to the systemic map of how organizations actually function, the Burke and Litwin model from '92. You mentioned it's designed explicitly to show causal linkages, right, related to performance and change.
Yes, exactly. It's not just a list of organizational variables. It's a diagram. It's got arrows connecting things, showing quite precise cause and effect relationships.
How many variables are we talking about?
The model lays out 12 core variables, or boxes as they're often shown. These represent different components of an organization, and they all ultimately feed into organizational performance, which is kind of the final outcome at the very bottom of the model.
And the arrows connecting them.
The arrows indicate that a change in one area, well, it typically flows through and impacts other areas in a pretty predictable direction. It really conveys that open systems principle. The idea that the organization is a system and everything is interconnected. You can't really change one part in isolation.
Right, makes sense. And crucially, the model organizes these 12 variables into two distinct categories, correct?
Yeah.
Which define two different types of change dynamics.
Yes, and this is maybe the most fundamental takeaway from the model, because it helps you, the listener, immediately categorize the level of intervention that might be needed.
Okay, what are the two types?
Well, first we have transformational change. This is associated with the really deep fundamental shifts in an organization. It involves processes that require fundamental changes in behavior and, critically, changes in the organization's underlying value systems. These are the major rethinks of purpose.
The big stuff.
The really big stuff. And then second, we have transactional change. This deals more with the everyday, the more immediate interactions of human behavior within the existing organizational setup.
Okay, transformational and transactional. Let's focus first on the big drivers, the transformational variables. These are in the upper half of the model, right?
That's right, the upper half. There are 4 core transformational variables.
What are they?
They are the external environment, mission and strategy, leadership, and organizational culture.
Okay, environment, mission, strategy, leadership, culture. And why do these drive deep change?
Well, these are the variables that fundamentally drive the large-scale, deep changes. Typically, these changes get initiated when the organization has to adapt dramatically to something happening outside.
Like market shifts or new regulations.
Exactly. Or when it needs to fundamentally redefine its core purpose. Why do we exist? What business are we really in? Burke and Litwin make it really clear. A change in one of these 4 variables is almost always required for genuine system-wide change, especially if you're trying to shift the organizational culture itself.
So they set the tone.
They set the tone, the overall direction, and the internal philosophy of the organization.
So if you want those fundamental shifts in how the organization operates, how it feels, you have to target these top-tier items. If you ignore them, any tactical fixes you try lower down are probably just going to be superficial. Is that fair?
That's precisely it. Now, the lower half of the model, that contains the transactional variables. These are absolutely necessary for day-to-day operations. They're generally within the scope of what management controls directly. They are, in a sense, the mechanisms of implementation.
Okay, what's included down there?
The transactional variables include things like structure the org chart, roles, responsibilities, management practices, what managers actually do day-to-day, also systems, which covers policies and procedures, work unit climate, the feel of a specific team, and then variables related to the individual, task and individual skills, individual needs and values, and finally, motivation.
Okay, quite a few more down there. And the dynamic here is different.
Yeah, the dynamic is different. Transactional change usually involves interactions that are often shorter term, maybe more reactive, tweaking a process, adjusting the org chart slightly, updating a procedures manual, things managers do all the time.
Whereas transformational changes.
Those require sustained upheaval, often over a long period, because they challenge the organization's very reason for being, its identity, its deepest habits.
Got it. Now, you mentioned the arrows. The causality is what really defines this model. What does the direction of those arrows tell us? How should change efforts be initiated? Where will the impact be felt?
Right. The directionality is key. The prevailing direction in the model is generally downward and outward. So, for example, changes in the external environment often force a change in the organization's mission and strategy.
Makes sense. The world changes, so the plan has to change.
Exactly. Then, that new strategy requires changes in leadership behavior to support it. which in turn impacts the organizational culture. And that then cascades down, influencing things like structure, systems, and management practices.
So it flows from the top down mostly.
Mostly, yes. And this downward flow is critical because Burke and Litwin argue that certain variables carry much more weight than others.
Ah, okay. So not all boxes are created equal.
Not in terms of impact, no. They suggest that mission and strategy, leadership, and organizational culture, those top-tier transformational variables, they carry more weight. They have a far greater impact on the total system, especially during large-scale change, than the transactional variables lower down, like structure or management practices.
Can you give an analogy for that, the weight idea?
Sure. Think of it like this, and this is a key idea for you, the listener, to grasp. Imagine you're trying to steer a massive ocean-going tanker. That's the organization.
Okay, huge ship.
Huge ship. Now, the transactional variables, structure, systems, management practices, they're like small outboard motors you've bolted onto the sides. They can help with minor adjustments, maybe nudge it a bit.
Right.
But the transformational variables, the leadership, the strategy, the deep culture, those are the massive engine blocks down below and the deep keel under the water. They determine the ship's fundamental power and direction.
Okay, got it.
So, if the main engine is running in reverse, maybe the culture says, don't trust management, or avoid risk at all costs, and you try to steer the tanker using just one of those small outboard motors, say, introducing a new management practice for risk-taking.
You're fighting the main engine.
You're fighting the massive inertia of the whole system. The small change, the transactional change, will be completely overwhelmed by the heavier current, the weight of that underlying culture and leadership direction.
Wow, that perfectly illustrates why so many change efforts fail, doesn't it? The ones that focus only on the transactional level. Maybe they just change the org chart, the structure, but they don't address the underlying culture or leadership behaviors.
Exactly. They don't have enough weight, enough leverage to overcome a misaligned culture or leadership that's pushing in the opposite direction.
You're fighting the gravitational pull, almost.
That's a good way to think of it. You're fighting the gravitational pull of those deep, heavy variables. If you try to change performance by only adjusting structure, for example, but your culture and leadership are fundamentally misaligned with that new structure's purpose, you're likely fighting against this heavier, invisible countercurrent that will eventually just pull the organization right back to where it started.
So the message is clear. You have to align the big, heavy blocks at the top of the model first, or at least concurrently.
You really do, especially for significant, lasting change.
Okay, let's zoom in a bit now on the specific definitions for these 12 variables, starting right at the top with the ultimate initiator of change, the external environment. For anyone planning change, this is often where the justification comes from, right? The market is changing, so we have to.
Absolutely. The external environment is defined pretty broadly in the model. It's basically any outside condition or situation that influences the organization's performance. So this includes everything from economic factors, interest rates, recessions, booms, technological shifts. Think artificial intelligence right now. It's huge.
Definitely.
Marketplace dynamics, what are competitors doing, how are customer behaviors changing, social conditions, financial markets, and of course, political or governmental circumstances, regulations. Burke and Litwin identify this as the chief external influence, the thing that often kicks off the need for that deep transformational change. If the world outside changes significantly, the organization often has to rethink its reason for being.
And that external pressure then directly influences the next variable down, which is the organization's mission and strategy.
Correct. Mission and strategy is basically the organization's declared purpose. What are the core beliefs held by the top management? And, crucially, how does the organization plan to achieve effectiveness, to win, over an extended timescale? The strategy defines its competitive position, its roadmap. These variables, mission and strategy, they're essentially setting the central purpose for the entire system. And ideally, they should flow logically from understanding those external conditions.
Okay. Moving across the top layer, we get to leadership. How do Burke and Litwin define leadership here, and why is it transformational?
Leadership isn't just defined by the person in the corner office. It's defined by the activities that provide overall guidance and direction for the organization. It includes setting behavioral role models, how do leaders act, and expressing the organization's core values. Leadership provides the fuel and the direction for those massive engine blocks we talked about.
Okay.
They also explicitly reference those classic distinctions in leadership theory. Transformational leadership, which is about inspiring fundamental change, building commitment, painting a vision,
right? Like Burns or Zalesnik talked about.
Exactly. Versus transactional leadership, which is often equated more with management, focusing on the daily exchanges, efficiency, rewards, and punishments. The model acknowledges both types are necessary. You need good management. But it's the transformational side, the vision, the role modeling, the setting of deep values, that's what truly affects the deep culture and drives major change.
Okay, that makes sense. Now we get to a really critical distinction, one that honestly is often an aha moment for people studying organizational change. The difference between organizational culture and work unit climate. These terms get thrown around almost interchangeably sometimes, don't they?
They do all the time, and it causes a lot of confusion. This distinction is absolutely critical for accurate diagnosis. Culture is the deep variable. It's the foundation, drawing from fields like anthropology. It refers to those underlying, often unconscious, assumptions, shared values, norms, the things that guide how the social system behaves. It's the organization's deep DNA.
Hard to see, hard to change.
Exactly. And crucially, culture is highly resistant to change because it defines the way we really do things around here. The unwritten rules for survival and success within that specific organization.
So culture is the iceberg below the waterline.
That's a perfect analogy.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas climate is much more immediate, more visible. It's above the waterline. Work unit climate is defined as the collective current feelings, expectations, and attitudes of the members within a specific work unit or team.
So it's more about perception and feeling.
Yes. It's psychological, it's behavioral, and it's often short-term reflective. It's how people feel right now about their immediate work environment.
Can you give an example to make that difference clearer?
Sure. Imagine a manager tries to improve morale. They put up some motivational posters, maybe run a new Employee of the Month incentive program. That might change the immediate climate. People might feel slightly better for a week or two.
Okay.
But if the underlying culture holds this deep-seated assumption that management is fundamentally untrustworthy and they'll cut our bonuses at the first sign of trouble.
Then the posters don't really matter.
Exactly. Then the climate change is superficial. It's short-lived, because the deep cultural belief undermines it. Climate is influenced directly by those transactional variables, the structure, the management practices, the systems. But ultimately, climate is simply the manifestation of the deeper culture, but at the local work unit level.
So if the climate in a team is toxic,
chances are the underlying culture supports or enables that toxicity in some way. Climate is the symptom. Culture is often the root cause.
wow, that analogy with the motivational posters really hits home. The transactional efforts change the surface appearance, the climate. The behavior change.
Precisely.
Okay, let's pivot now to the rest of those transactional variables, the ones vital for tactical change and just getting work done day to day. Starting with structure.
Right. Structure is the formal organizational framework. It's defined by things like the function of different roles, specific responsibilities tied to those roles, decision-making authority, who gets to decide what, communication channels, who reports to whom, reporting relationships. It's basically how the organization formally divides up the work and then coordinates it. The org chart is a common representation of structure.
So changing the structure might mean adding a new department or changing who someone reports to.
Yes. But here's the catch, linking back to culture. Imagine you implement a structural change on paper, flattening the hierarchy. But if the deep culture mandates that all important communication must still flow through the single senior leader for approval,
then the new structure doesn't really change anything.
exactly, then the structural change has no actual impact on real decision-making authority or communication flow. The cultural weight just overrides the formal structural logic.
Okay. Next, transactional variable. Management practices. These are the behaviors we actually see managers doing,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. These are the day-to-day behaviors managers use to actually implement the organization's human and material resources. These are specific, observable actions that tend to cluster together. Things like encouraging subordinates to perform tasks well, providing constructive feedback, rewarding positive behavior.
Or the negative side.
Or, conversely, micromanaging everything, hoarding information, punishing mistakes harshly. Management practices are the actions managers take in the normal course of events to try and meet organizational goals. And importantly, these practices are directly influenced by the organization's culture and the examples set by leadership.
Okay. And finally, the formal systems, policies, and procedures. These are the things that facilitate work.
That's right. Systems are the formalized practices, often written down somewhere, that help facilitate work getting done. This covers a lot. Everything from the management information system, how does data flow through the organization,
Hmm.
to performance appraisal processes, how do we evaluate people, goal-setting mechanisms, the budgeting process. Systems basically formalize the how-to for many recurring activities.
Is there one system that's particularly important?
Well, Burke and Litwin specifically highlight the organizational reward system as a really significant subsystem within systems
Why that one?
because it's usually highly visible. It dictates who gets what raises, bonuses, promotions, when, and why. Because of that visibility, the reward system is a key way the company's actual values, its culture, get expressed, regardless of what the mission statement says.
Ah, so if the strategy says teamwork is crucial.
Right. But the reward system only recognizes and rewards individual competitive achievement.
Then the system is fighting the strategy.
Exactly. The system is actively working against the strategy and probably reinforcing an individualistic culture. It's a powerful transactional lever, the reward system, but it's one that is very easily misaligned with those deeper transformational variables.
Got it. And then we also have those variables focus more on the individual worker right at the bottom of the transactional layer.
Yes, the model includes variables like task and individual skills, basically. Is there a good match between the job's requirements and the person's capabilities? Also, individual needs and values. What does the employee expect and value from their work environment? Things like autonomy, recognition, work-life balance. And finally, motivation arousal. The individual's arousal, their drive, their commitment to putting in directed effort towards organizational goals.
And these are sort of the final points of impact before we get to actual performance.
They are really the final dominoes in the chain. Every single variable above these three in the model ultimately affects the individual worker's ability to do the job, their belief system about the job and the company, and their willingness to perform.
So if the systems are faulty,
The task is made harder, skills might not be utilized if management practices are poor.
individual motivation probably plummets.
Absolutely. It demonstrates it's a complete causal chain flowing all the way down to individual behavior and ultimately overall organizational performance. Okay, so now we can transition. We've used the Burke-Litwin model to understand the why, the underlying organizational dynamics, the causal links, why things might be failing. Now we shift to action. How do we use Goodyear's framework to identify what specifically needs to be targeted for change? This is where we synthesize the diagnostic theory into practical application.
Right. Because just understanding the system isn't enough. You have to know where to intervene. And Goodyear provides this classification, right? Organizational elements that can be the precise targets or objects of change. These are the specific components a leader can intentionally focus on.
Exactly. If we can't clearly name the object or objects of change, then we can't really define the change effort properly. It remains vague.
Okay, so let's detail these 5 categories she lays out. These really help define the scope of the intervention for that change statement tool we'll discuss later.
Okay. First category, activities.
What falls under activities?
These are the discrete, observable actions the organization performs day to day. Things like specific tasks people do, the production of goods or services, conducting training programs. Changing an activity is often the most basic, most granular level of intervention.
Okay. Second category, processes.
Processes are about how those activities are linked together, how work flows.
So things like
Things like decision-making structures, how are decisions made and approved, control protocols, how do we ensure quality or compliance, documented procedures, policies. If a manager is always slow to approve purchase orders, holding things up, that's likely a process problem related to the decision-making flow.
got it. Third category, people.
Now, this one covers the dynamics among individuals within the organization. It includes their working relationships, the established norms of behavior within specific teams, teamwork dynamics, and also voluntary actions like discretionary effort, people going the extra mile.
And importantly, Goodyear distinguishes this people element from the deeper culture.
Yes, that's a key distinction. People here is more about the interactions and team norms, whereas culture, the fourth category, is the deeper one.
Okay, so tell us about culture as an object of change.
Culture, as an object, refers to targeting those deep underlying values, the often unspoken assumptions about risk, about motivation, about customers, about failure, the fundamental belief systems. For instance, if the prevailing culture in an organization believes that any failure should be hidden, covered up, that's a culture object that you would have to target directly if you genuinely wanted to promote innovation and learning from mistakes.
Makes sense. And the final fifth category,
The fifth is purpose.
purpose. What does that encompass?
Purpose addresses the very reason the organization exists in the first place. This includes its strategic direction, how it positions itself relative to the external environment. That links directly back to Burke Litwin's mission and strategy variable. It also includes the organization's identity, its professional context, its ethical stance, what it stands for.
So targeting purpose means a really fundamental change.
Yes. Targeting purpose usually means fundamentally changing the organization's overall direction or its core reason for existence. Big stuff.
Okay, those 5 categories, activities, processes, people, culture, purpose, give us a concrete menu of potential targets. Let's use that specific example. Goodyear provided the IT service desk to see how identifying these objects of change actually works in practice, how it helps clarify things and maybe even reduce resistance.
Right, that's a great practical example. The destabilizing force, the trigger, in that case, was persistent customer complaints. Service was perceived as slow and unfriendly. This prompted the new manager to do a diagnostic deep dive. And importantly, they engaged the employees doing the work, the technical experts in that diagnosis.
And what did they find? Was it just one thing?
No, and that's typical. They found multiple intertwined underlying issues, which meant they needed a multi-object solution. First, pretty straightforward, the technology supporting the help function was seriously outdated. Employees were literally consulting old paper manuals sometimes, which obviously slowed service times way down.
Okay, so that sounds like a process issue.
Exactly. A clear process inadequacy. The procedure for serving the client was inefficient because the tools and technology were flawed. But crucially, the manager also discovered a behavioral problem. And this stemmed from a deeper assumption held by some employees.
Ah, okay. What was that?
It was a culture issue. The employees actually differed in their underlying view of the customers they served. Some believed, users were trying their best but just needed help. But a significant chunk of the service desk team operated under the assumption that users were fundamentally lazy or incompetent or just weren't trying to solve problems themselves before calling.
Wow. That assumption about users.
Yeah.
That's a fundamental cultural belief, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And that belief affects service quality far more profoundly, perhaps, than just having slow technology.
Because if you fixed only the technology.
Right. If the successful outcome had focused only on upgrading the tech, fixing the process, the employees who held that negative cultural assumption about users, they might simply use the new, faster tools to be more efficiently rude or dismissive.
So it wouldn't solve the core customer satisfaction problem.
Probably not. Therefore, the successful outcomes they defined had to target both issues. One outcome was tangible. Employees rate their new tools highly in terms of utility and efficiency. That addresses the process. But the other outcome was behavioral and cultural. Employees begin each interaction with a positive outlook and demonstrate genuine pride in their ability to help. They show empathy. That addresses the culture.
So the objects of change were clearly identified as both process, the technology and tools, and culture, those underlying assumptions about users.
Exactly. And this example really illustrates a common practical reality. Change situations often generate 2 or more related but distinct change targets. And you often have to address them simultaneously or at least in a coordinated way for the overall effort to succeed.
This synthesis seems really powerful, especially because it allows for the use of neutral, non-blaming language. Goodyear emphasizes that point, right?
Yeah.
As a way to mitigate resistance.
Absolutely. That's a key benefit. By identifying these neutral elements, process, culture, structure, activities, purpose, the leader can frame the conversation in a much more fact-based way. So instead of walking into the service desk and saying, hey, your attitude is terrible, which immediately puts people on the defensive,
Right.
the focus becomes something like, okay, team, through our diagnosis, we've identified a potential misalignment in our shared culture regarding user assumptions, and that seems to be impacting service. We need to work together to address that.
It changes the dynamic.
It promotes a you and me against the problem stance rather than me criticizing you. And that collaborative stance is absolutely fundamental to getting buy-in and enabling a successful implementation.
Okay, and we can actually connect this right back to the Burke-Litwin model again, can't we? To sort of validate why this multi-object approach, especially involving culture, is often necessary.
Yes, we can. Burke and Litwin, in their original work, identified 4 specific failure points or common problems that tend to arise when an organization tries to change climate and culture only by using transactional actions. That is, trying to fix things using only the tools from the bottom half of their model.
Okay, what were those 4 specific issues, the ones that kept getting undermined by the deeper transformational variables?
Okay, the first one they identified was sense of direction.
Sense of direction, how does that link?
This is often the direct effect of mission clarity, or usually the lack thereof coming from the top. If the transformational mission and strategy is vague or confusing, the work unit climate suffers down below because individuals simply lack a coherent sense of purpose for their daily tasks. They don't see how their work fits in.
Okay, lack of clear mission hurts climate. What's the second one?
Second was role and responsibility. This is typically an effect of the structure, but it gets reinforced by day-to-day manager practice. So if the formal structure creates ambiguous roles or overlapping responsibilities, managers often inadvertently reinforce that ambiguity through their daily behaviors, maybe assigning the same task to 2 people or not clarifying who owns what. This leads to confusion, conflict, frustration within the team climate.
So even if you fix the org chart, the structure on paper, if the manager, through their management practice, continues to let 2 employees fight over the same task, the ambiguity and bad climate persist.
Precisely. The practice reinforces the structural flaw or even creates ambiguity where the structure was clear. Third failure point, standards and commitment.
Standards and commitment, how does that play out?
This is primarily seen as an effect of manager practice, but it's strongly reinforced by the underlying culture. If managers consistently don't hold employees to high standards, if they tolerate mediocrity or inconsistent performance, the underlying culture implicitly starts to endorse lower commitment. It becomes acceptable to just get by, and that damages performance across the board.
The culture learns that mediocrity is okay.
Yes. And the fourth point was fairness of rewards.
The reward system begins.
Exactly. This is seen as an effect of the formal systems like the compensation structure, the appraisal process, but again, it's heavily reinforced by manager practice. If the compensation and appraisal systems themselves are perceived as unfair, biased, or maybe just poorly designed, that systemic issue is often made much worse by how individual managers actually implement those reward decisions day to day. Subjectivity, perceived favoritism.
Right, the manager's actions make the system feel even less fair.
Correct. So these 4 points, sense of direction, role and responsibility, standards and commitment, fairness of rewards, they perfectly prove the integrity of that Burke-Litwin causal model, I think. They show that even seemingly transactional issues like a dysfunctional structure or an unfair system are fundamentally influenced and often reinforced by the deeper culture and the daily management practices, which themselves are influenced by leadership.
It really drives home that point.
Yeah.
You often can't fix the bottom half of the model effectively without achieving alignment in the top half first. Because as you said, the top half carries all the weight. It sets the context. Okay, we've mostly been talking about planned change, or maybe change driven by discovering internal problems like the IT service desk. But Goodyear also specifically addresses that special case of crisis change. The unplanned, unanticipated shock that gets forced on the organization, usually from the external environment. The kind that demands immediate action just to survive, protect reputation, or maybe protect life.
Right. Crises like a major cybersecurity breach, a natural disaster hitting operations, a sudden regulatory shutdown, these demand high-speed action. It feels fundamentally different from a slow, deliberate, planned change effort.
It does. But Goodyear argues that the underlying tools, the diagnostic thinking, they remain fundamentally the same, even in crisis mode.
Yes, that's her point. It's still absolutely necessary, maybe even more necessary, even when everyone's in a state of high alarm, to pause briefly, pause to define what a successful outcome looks like, and to identify the specific objects of change that need immediate attention.
Why is that so important in a crisis? Isn't speed the only thing that matters?
Well, speed matters, but speed without direction is just flailing. The crisis actually reinforces the need for clarity, because without a shared definition of a successful outcome, different teams or individuals will immediately diverge in their efforts. They'll start working based on their own individual priorities or functional perspectives.
So the legal team focuses only on liability.
Right. And the IT team focuses only on fixing the network firewall. And maybe the PR team focuses only on managing the media narrative. Without coordination, those efforts might even conflict.
Okay. The example she uses of the chief information officer dealing with that student data hacking incident seems really illuminating here. Because the leadership team actually did pause, didn't they? Even right in the middle of this intense crisis. They had external agencies involved, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, high pressure. But they paused.
They did. And that pause, however brief, provided the necessary grounding. It helped override the natural panic response that can take over. The leadership team identified three core successful outcomes almost immediately, right at the start.
What were they?
First, the absolute priority was taking care of the students and staff whose data might have been compromised. That was non-negotiable. Second, they committed to being rigorously honest with everyone, students, parents, the public, regulators, about what happened and what they were doing to fix it. Transparency. And third, they aimed to establish an open-minded partnership with all employees, with all internal departments, and critically, with all those external agencies involved. No defensiveness, just collaboration.
And those three core outcomes then drove the response.
They drove the entire response for the next 18 months, according to the account. By having that crystal clear shared focus from the outset, they were able to quickly identify the specific work needed and form teams targeting the necessary objects of change.
So things like?
Things like technology investigation and mitigation that's hitting process and activity, legal counsel and risk management impacting systems and maybe people elements, public relations and communication strategy hitting purpose and activities, and human resources support for affected individuals, clearly people and systems.
Wow. So it really demonstrates that regardless of the time frame, whether it's a 6-month strategic plan or a 6-hour crisis response, or the source of the change, that disciplined act of pausing to identify a clear vision and the specific objects of change remains absolutely critical for focused, effective action.
Exactly. The analysis needed to create an effective change statement. It's flexible. It can be done at different depths and different time frames. It can be part of a long strategy review, or it could be roughed out on a whiteboard in a 60-minute crisis huddle. The principles hold.
Okay, this brings us nicely to the final practical tool we wanted to unpack from Goodyear, the change statement itself. This is the document, the tool that operationalizes all the diagnosis and goal setting we've been discussing. It's the template for achieving that essential clarity. What are the required components of a good change statement, according to Goodyear?
Right. An effective change statement. It's meant to document the core thinking and planning right at the very beginning of the change process. And its primary purpose is to communicate clearly to all the stakeholders involved. Goodyear outlines 4 required components. These components move the conversation logically from just describing the problem to outlining an actual action plan.
Okay, component number 1.
First, the reasons for the change. The statement has to clearly identify the initial driver. What kicked this off? It could be one or more of those destabilizing forces we talked about, a new leader with a new vision, a discovery from an internal audit, a market shift, a crisis. Or maybe it's a specific identified problem in a key service or process, or a deep culture problem that needs addressing, or simply a proactive decision to pursue a new strategic direction. You have to clearly state the why, the justification for the effort and potential pain of the transformation.
Okay, state the why, component number 2.
Second, simply and neutrally provide a description of the change itself, what is actually being proposed or undertaken.
Straightforward. Third component.
Third, and this is perhaps the most crucial for motivation, the vision of the successful outcome. This is critical. It's painting the picture of what the new reality will look like when the change is successfully achieved. What will be different? What will be better? It has to be defined clearly enough and compellingly enough to overcome inertia, maybe overcome skepticism, and genuinely motivate participation, especially among those experts involved in the dance of implementation.
Got it. Paint the picture of success.
Yeah.
And the final required component.
And finally, fourth, the objects of change. This is where you explicitly name the specific organizational functions or elements, drawing directly from that Goodyear framework of activities, processes, people, culture, purpose, which itself is informed by the variables in the Burke-Litwin model. These are the precise focus of the change effort. By clearly naming the object or objects, whether it's process or culture or structure or a combination, you define the scope of the work and you limit speculation about what isn't being changed.
Okay, so reasons, description, vision, and objects. That seems like a really solid, clear framework for communicating change. Now, this entire framework, both the Burke-Litwin diagnostic model and Goodyear's practical change statement tool, it's all built on this foundation of causality, right? These things influence those things. Did the original Burke-Litwin research provide actual empirical evidence that their complex causal model holds up in the real world, in the messy reality of organizations?
Yes, absolutely. That's a really important point. They didn't just create the model in theory, they conducted rigorous validation studies across various types of organizations. For example, in some consulting work they did with British Airways back in the day, They collected data, ran the analysis, and they found that the organizational variables included in their model accounted for a remarkable 54% of the variance in employee ratings of team effectiveness.
Wow, 54%. That's huge in social science terms.
It's a massive amount of predictive power. It strongly suggests that the relationships mapped out by the arrows in their model, that causal chain, truly reflects how things operate in reality.
Any other examples?
Yeah, there was another more recent study mentioned focusing on a hospital setting. That study confirmed that leadership behaviors, the underlying culture, and day-to-day management practices were the two strongest predictors of work unit climate and ultimately overall organizational performance in that hospital.
So again, confirming the weight of those upper-level variables.
Exactly. It confirms that those heavy transformational variables, leadership and culture, are indeed the clearest drivers of the outcomes you see happening at the transactional level, like climate and performance. It really reinforces the idea that you're often forced to deal with those heavier variables first, or at least concurrently, if you want the lower tier, transactional variables to behave predictably and support your goals. Hashtag outro.
Okay, let's try and unpack this one last time then. Bring it all together.
Yeah.
We started today with that philosophical debate. Is change something we plan, or is it just constantly happening around us? And we established the absolute necessity of clear goal definition to overcome that implementation dilemma. The challenge of leading change when you have to rely on specialized expertise you might not fully possess yourself.
Right, that need for clarity, regardless of the change origin.
Then we dove deep into the Burke and Litwin causal model of organizational performance and change, a really detailed map. We saw how this model organizes organizational life into those two critical and differently weighted tiers. Transformational change at the top, driven by those heavy variables like mission, strategy, leadership, and the deep culture.
The big levers.
And then transactional change below that, driven by the lighter, more tactical implementation variables like management practices, structure, and systems.
The everyday adjustments.
Exactly. And finally, we synthesized all that diagnostic knowledge into the practical application tool of the change statement based on Goodyear's work, showing that understanding the specific difference between, say, a structure problem and a culture problem, being able to name the objects of change accurately, is absolutely essential. Essential for defining a truly successful outcome and for managing resistance effectively, even when the organization is facing a high-stakes crisis.
Yeah, that synthesis is key.
Yeah.
And if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, those validation studies supporting the Burke and Litwin model, they really confirmed a core organizational truth, a truth that managers have to grapple with every single day, which is this. When you try to change individual behavior or work unit behavior by focusing only on the transactional level, say, you just implement a new performance metric system or tweak a process, you are very likely to encounter resistance, confusion, maybe outright failure. Why? Because those deeper variables, the mission, the leadership signals, the underlying culture, they carry more weight. They exert a heavier and often counter-influence if they're not aligned with your transactional change.
The main engine fighting the outboard motor again.
Exactly. Which raises, I think, a final important question for you, the listener, to consider. How do you, as leader or change agent, establish the necessary diagnostic process, that vital pause for reflection, whether it's long or short, to ensure that the organization's stated mission and strategy are actually being lived by the leaders, that their behaviors truly align? How do you guarantee that your tactical, transactional changes aren't constantly being undermined by hidden, unchallenged cultural assumptions? Assumptions that maybe the leadership themselves don't even recognize they're upholding through their actions.
That alignment between the visible actions and the invisible beliefs.
That internal alignment, reconciling what we say we value with what our system actually rewards and encourages. That's where the true deep dive begins for any successful, lasting transformation effort.